The champagne cork popped the moment I stepped into the room, and for a heartbeat, no one noticed me standing there. Crystal glasses caught the light, laughter rippled across the air, and her diamonds sparkled like it had been polished just for this night. In my hand was an envelope, plain and unassuming, but heavier than anything I had ever carried. They didn't know yet that inside it was the one thing that could turn their celebration into silence. I didn't need to raise my voice or make a scene. All I had to do was wait for him to open it. Hello, my dears. I'm glad you're here with me today. And before I begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so tell me in the comments. Now let me take you back to that morning, the one that changed everything. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee in the air, the sunlight spilling across the counter in that soft way it does on slow mornings. He didn't look up from his plate, didn't even pause as he spread jam across his toast, and then, almost as if he were commenting on the weather, he said, "I need space." Just like that. No build-up, no explanation, no trembling voice to warn me that the ground beneath my life was about to give way. 20 years together. The laughter, the arguments, the milestones, the promises, all of it swept aside in a breath that smelled faintly of buttered bread. I remember staring at him, trying to read his face, searching for a crack, a flicker of regret. But he kept chewing like he'd just finished telling me the grocery list. My fork hovered in the air, my hand numb, my thoughts scrambling to make sense of what I'd just heard. I thought of the homes we had built, the memories tucked into their walls, the child we had raised, the plans we still had half-spoken for the years ahead. His voice was steady, but mine caught in my throat before I could even form a question. He thought space meant freedom, the kind that would open wide and welcome him into whatever life he was already dreaming about. But what he didn't know, not then, was that space can just as easily become a noose. And in time, he would feel it tighten. The days after that breakfast felt like stepping into a house that looked the same, but had lost its heartbeat. The rooms were quiet in a way that pressed against my ears, as if the silence itself was reminding me of who wasn't there. The bed seemed too big at night, the sheets cold on the side where he used to sleep, the dent in the pillow fading with each morning. I moved through the hours on habit alone, making coffee, opening the curtains, pretending that if I kept the rhythm, the ache would somehow dull. But it didn't. Friends would call or stop by, their faces tilted with that careful concern, asking what happened as if there was an answer that could make it easier to hear. I would smile in that polite, brittle way, telling them I was fine, because the truth was too heavy to pass around in conversation. 3 months slipped by like that, each one folding into the next until the days blurred. Then, one afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table, half listening to the hum of the refrigerator, when a notification lit up my phone. A friend had sent me a link, no message attached, just the blue highlight waiting for me to tap. And there they were. Engagement photos. His arm around her, her face tilted toward him in a way that looked practiced. The setting was familiar before my mind could place it, and then it hit me so sharply that I had to grip the edge of the table. Our old vacation home. The dock we had built together, where I had planted a garden that bloomed with colors every spring, now stood behind them like a backdrop borrowed from my life. I stared at the pictures, my eyes tracing every corner of the frame, seeing pieces of my own history wrapped around their new beginning. The same boards I had sanded with my hands, the same railing I had painted in the summer heat, now framing her in a white dress that seemed almost too bright. My garden was still there, overgrown but alive, a quiet witness to what had been taken. And all I could think was how strange it felt to see your own life handed to someone else like it had always belonged to them. Tell me, have you ever looked at a picture and realized it wasn't just an image? It was proof that someone had stepped into the place you once stood, without so much as looking back? It didn't take long for whispers to find their way to me. At first, I thought I was imagining the way people hesitated before speaking. The careful pauses, the way eyes seemed to flicker with something they didn't quite want to say. But one afternoon, a friend of a friend let it slip without meaning to, the way truth sometimes tumbles out when people think they're only filling the air with small talk. It was her. The secretary. The one I had seen at company events, always efficient, always smiling a little too brightly when he was around. For years I had brushed aside the little stings, telling myself I was being unfair, that a polite laugh or a lingering glance was nothing more than workplace familiarity. Now, each memory came back to me with a sharpness I couldn't ignore. Every moment rewound and replayed with a new, harsher light. A few days later, the confirmation came without even asking. Our old neighbor from the lake house called, her voice warm at first, then careful as she told me she had seen them there together, months before he ever asked for space. They weren't sneaking in late at night, no. They arrived in broad daylight, smiling, unloading groceries like they belonged there. She had even waved at them from her porch. I listened, my hand wrapped around the phone, my knuckles tight, trying to keep my voice steady as she spoke. I thanked her, told her I appreciated her calling, and when we hung up, I just sat there staring at the wall. The truth moved through me slowly at first, not like a sudden storm, but like water seeping into cracks, filling every space until there was no air left to breathe. The missing hours, the unexplained absences, the late nights at the office, all the things I had shrugged off or explained away, now lined up in perfect order, a chain of betrayals disguised as routine. The business trips that didn't require a suitcase, the sudden preference for working weekends, the small changes in the way he spoke to me, as though his mind was always somewhere else. It wasn't my imagination, it wasn't paranoia, it had been real all along. But alongside the hurt, something else began to take shape. It wasn't rage exactly, though my hands shook when I thought about it too long. It wasn't despair either, because I had already survived the worst of it, the moment he decided I wasn't worth the truth. No, what settled into me was colder, sharper, a kind of focus I hadn't felt in years. Hurt has a way of dulling your edges, making you smaller so you can fit into the space someone else leaves for you. But once you see clearly, once you know without doubt, those edges start to come back. And mine were beginning to gleam. I realized I didn't need to confront him right then. I didn't need to beg for explanations or throw accusations into the air where they could be twisted or denied. What I needed was time and a plan. Because if he thought walking away with her meant freedom, he had forgotten something important. Freedom can be an illusion, and sometimes it comes with chains you can't see until they've already wrapped around your neck. And I knew exactly how to pull them tight. I didn't go straight to the lawyer's office. I waited a few days, letting my mind turn over the possibilities until the edges of the plan began to take shape. When I finally walked in, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. The kind of place where the walls themselves seemed to understand the weight of secrets. I sat across from him, my fingers resting on the leather arm of the chair, and I told him what I needed to know. I asked about the trust, about the clause I had once glanced at years ago, but never truly thought I would have to use. He pulled the file from his cabinet, flipped through the pages with practiced hands, and then looked up at me with a small nod. It was still there, still valid, untouched and airtight. He explained it plainly, each word settling like a stone in my chest. If my husband remarried within a year of divorcing me without cause, his share of the trust would be forfeited. No loopholes, no soft edges to blur the meaning. I leaned back slightly, letting the reality of it settle over me, feeling the slow, cold satisfaction that comes when you realize you have been holding a winning card without even knowing it. I asked him if he thought my husband would remember it. The lawyer gave a faint, almost amused smile, and said no. Men in his position rarely think about the fine print when they believe they're starting fresh. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out into the sunlight with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. This wasn't the kind of battle you fought with raised voices or public scenes. This was a battle that lived in quiet corridors, between lines of ink on paper, where signatures carried more weight than any argument ever could. I decided then there would be no warning, no conversation, to give him the chance to wriggle free. I would let him walk straight into it, so sure of his freedom that he wouldn't see the walls closing in until it was far too late. The days that followed felt different. The hurt was still there, yes, but it no longer consumed me. It had been tempered into something stronger, like steel forged in heat. I began to think of him and her, laughing over their champagne, completely unaware that the clock was ticking in a way neither of them could hear. I thought of the papers waiting, the clause sitting quietly in its place, ready to strip him of the future he thought he was building. Some battles aren't fought in the open. They're signed, sealed, and delivered. And mine was already halfway in the envelope. It was almost by accident that I learned about their engagement weekend. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it in passing, the way people do when they assume you've already heard, as if I were still part of that circle where news travels freely. They were headed to the resort by the lake, the one with the long stretch of white sand and the tall glass windows that caught the sunset like a painting. I remembered it well. We had stayed there once years ago, back when we were still the kind of couple people looked at and thought we would last forever. Hearing the name now was like feeling the brush of a blade against my skin, cold and deliberate. I didn't let the moment pass. That very evening, I called the resort. My voice was calm, my words measured, as I inquired about availability for that weekend. The woman on the other end was polite, asking for my name to make the booking. I gave her my maiden name, the one he had all but erased over 2 decades ago. There was a strange comfort in saying it out loud again, as if I were reclaiming a piece of myself that had been quietly sitting in the shadows, waiting to be called forward. I secured a suite directly next to theirs, a room with a balcony that would overlook the very same view they would be toasting under. Once the booking was confirmed, I turned my attention to the letter. It had to be perfect, not just in wording, but in weight and presentation. I took out the documents from my lawyer's office, the ones that spelled out the terms of the trust with absolute clarity. I read them again slowly, letting each sentence settle in my mind until I could hear it without looking at the page. Then I began to draft my own note. Concise, formal, and impossible to misinterpret. I made sure it left no room for him to wriggle free, no chance to claim misunderstanding. I had it typed, printed on crisp paper, and slipped it into a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with my initials. For days afterward, I kept it close, hidden away in a drawer. But I would take it out now and then, just to hold it in my hands. It felt lighter than it should for the weight it carried. I pictured him opening it, the way his face would shift, the way the air around him would seem to still. I pictured her, standing beside him, the sparkle of her ring catching the light just before her expression changed. And I knew that when the moment came, I wouldn't need to say a word. He would open it in front of the one person he left me for, and the truth inside would be enough to strip the shine from their perfect little celebration. When the weekend finally arrived, I drove up to the resort with a calmness that felt almost unnatural. The kind of calm you get when you know every move has already been set in place. The entrance was just as I remembered. Stone pillars, flowers spilling from neat clay pots, the faint sound of water from the fountain in the courtyard. I stepped out of my car, handed my keys to the valet, and walked toward the glass doors as if I belonged there. Because in that moment, I did. The lobby was warm with golden light, filled with the low hum of conversation, the rustle of suitcases, and the gentle echo of footsteps on polished floors. At the check-in desk, I gave my maiden name. The clerk smiled, tapped the keyboard, and handed me a room key in a slim paper sleeve. My suite was just as I'd requested, right next to theirs, with a view of the lake that was almost identical. I unpacked slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to take my time, to settle into the space, to feel the anticipation stretch. From my balcony, I could see the terrace where they would no doubt be gathering later. Even at this hour, the lake shimmered, and the air smelled faintly of pine and distant wood smoke. Later that afternoon, I decided to walk down toward the terrace, blending in with the other guests as if I were simply enjoying the grounds. I wore a simple dress, nothing that would draw attention, and carried a light shawl over my arm. That's when I saw them. They were exactly where I expected them to be, standing near the railing, arm in arm, as if the world had been built just for the two of them. He looked tanned, rested, smiling in that easy way he used to smile at me. And she, well, she had a way of leaning into him as though she'd been doing it her whole life. Then my eyes caught something else, something small but sharp enough to cut through the scene. Around her neck was a gold necklace I knew instantly. It was one he had given me years ago, on an anniversary I had believed meant something. I remembered the way he had fastened it for me, his fingers brushing the back of my neck, the warmth of his breath when he kissed my shoulder after. Seeing it there now, resting against her collarbone, turned that memory from something warm into something cold and jagged. I stood there for a moment, watching them laugh, the sound carrying faintly on the breeze. I felt the sting, yes, but it didn't burn the way it might have months ago. Instead, it was tempered by the knowledge of what I carried upstairs in that cream-colored envelope. That paper was my quiet equalizer, my unseen weapon. They were standing there so sure, so certain of the life ahead of them, and not one part of them knew that the ground beneath their feet was already cracking. I didn't turn away because it hurt. I turned away because I didn't need to see anymore. I already knew how this story would end, and soon enough, so would they. By the time the sun had slipped low enough to stain the lake in shades of gold and rose, the resort had taken on that soft, expectant glow that comes just before the evening begins in earnest. Lamps flickered on across the terrace, casting small pools of warm light, and the gentle hum of conversation mingled with the faint pop of corks being freed from their bottles. I could smell the sweetness of champagne in the air before I even stepped outside. My envelope rested in my hand, not clutched tight, but held loosely, like it was just another piece of paper, instead of the end of someone's imagined future. I walked slowly, my steps measured, letting the night air brush over my skin as I crossed from the quiet shadow of my suite toward the lit terrace. Each step carried me closer to the cluster of guests, their laughter rising and falling in waves. And then, like the faintest shift in the wind, I felt it happen. Their attention turning. Conversations stalled, glasses paused midair, eyes beginning to follow me as if drawn without thought. A hush doesn't need to be complete to be felt. It moves through a crowd in ripples, and I could feel each one touch me as I passed. I saw him before he saw me. He was standing near the edge of the terrace, the lake behind him, a glass in his hand and her arm linked with his. His profile was relaxed, his expression easy, the kind of look a man wears when he believes his world is steady and secure. And then his eyes lifted and found mine. The stillness in him was immediate. His smile faltered, his grip on the glass tightened just slightly, and for a moment he looked like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. I didn't stop walking. I didn't rush either. When I reached them, I let my gaze meet hers first, taking in the way her expression shifted from mild curiosity to something closer to unease. She glanced between us, searching for a cue. I gave her none. Instead, I turned to him, and in a voice as calm as if I were commenting on the weather, I said, "Congratulations to you both." My lips curved in a polite smile, one that held no warmth but no malice either, and before he could shape a single word in response, I extended my hand and offered him the envelope. He looked down at it, his brows drawing together just slightly, then back up me. I held his gaze, steady, unblinking, until his hand lifted almost on instinct and took it. The weight of the paper shifted from my fingers to his, and in that small exchange, the balance of the evening shifted with it. I gave him a slight nod, turned away without another word, and began to walk back across the terrace, leaving the laughter, the light, and the whispers behind me. I didn't need to see his face when he opened it. I already knew what it would look like. I didn't linger to watch him open it. The moment the envelope left my hand, I turned and began walking back toward the quiet of my suite, my steps slow and deliberate, not because I was unsure, but because there was no need to hurry. Behind me, the chatter of the terrace dulled for a moment, like the air had shifted, carrying with the air behind me. He must have opened it quickly, thinking it was something simple. But instead, he found the legal notification, spelling out that his remarriage within a year of divorcing me without cause would strip him of his share of the trust, permanently and without appeal. I could imagine her leaning in, catching just enough of the words to understand. I could almost hear the sharp intake of breath before the champagne glass slipped from her fingers, the delicate ring of crystal against stone. The whispers would have turned into stares, into questions. I didn't need to see it. I walked on, reached my suite, closed the door, and let the silence wrap around me. The work was done. The next morning, the calls began. Friends who'd been there told me how the celebration unraveled. She accused him of hiding the truth, her voice rising until every guest could hear. He tried to explain, but every word made it worse. People started leaving early, and by the end of the night, the terrace looked abandoned. By sunrise, the engagement was on hold. And me? I sat in my own home, a warm cup of tea in hand, sunlight spilling across the floor. No gloating, no need for it, just calm. There's a certain power in silence. I had let him walk right into his own undoing, the fine print doing all the talking for me. He had once signed those papers in love, never imagining that same signature would one day be the seal on his downfall. Not all battles are won by speaking. Some are won by waiting, by knowing the moment when silence will cut the deepest. Tell me, have you ever let silence do the talking for you? If you have, write it below or just say I waited. He asked for space, and I gave him every inch of it, without me, without the home we built, without the future he thought was certain. Strength is not found in raising your voice, but in knowing when to step away with your dignity intact and the quiet satisfaction of a win you never had to announce. Life has a way of returning what was taken, sometimes in ways more poetic than you could ever plan. And if you're watching this alone, remember, you are not alone. Subscribe, and we'll keep the light burning together.